Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Hope you've been enjoying this day of amazing talks as much as I have. Honored to be included. Just a little introduction to myself. I am Stephen Shaw. I'm an iOS developer out of Richmond, Virginia. I work at a consulting firm here in town called Shaco Mobile. And today I will be talking to you about, go ahead and present desktop. The power of remote config and Codable. It's a pretty handy combination of tools. So let's go ahead and get started with some introductions to the technologies in question. So starting with remote config, this is actually a product offered by Google. It falls under the kind of Firebase umbrella of tools or kind of suite of tools. Some of you may be familiar with the real-time database or analytics, different things like that that are also offered by Firebase. Remote config is sometimes an overlooked tool, but hopefully not after today. Its kind of core offering is that it gives you the ability to dynamically update your app at runtime, essentially, and it gives you the ability to customize either the appearance or behavior or content that is displayed via payload that's fetched, like I said, at runtime. So it gives you a very dynamic control over certain aspects of your app. And for our use case today, we're going to be looking at how you can use these configuration parameters that they're called in remote config to supply JSON to the application. And we're going to decode that into some custom Swift types and then use those throughout the app. So that brings us to Codable. So this should be a pretty familiar to most at this point, but for those unfamiliar with it, it's actually a type alias that combines decodable and encodable. So you can just conform to Codable and you get both. So it's not necessarily a protocol on its own, but you conform to it the same way. And as you might have guessed from the names, that gives you the ability to, it gives you a very simple to use API for encoding or decoding data as you need it via encode to or decode from helpers. One nice thing about Codable is that out of the box, if your stored properties on your custom types also conform to Codable, which a lot of the Swift standard library types do, as well as foundation types, and even things like array and dictionary, you automatically get conformance without having to write another line of code in your actual Swift type. So that's just a nice thing to call out because it's a way to prevent errors and possible bugs, as we've all had to write some of those encoding and decoding routines. All right, so for the kind of first use case that I wanted to step through today, we're going to be talking about a maintenance message. So this is a very familiar feature that gets implemented in a lot of applications where you might need to display some kind of blocking UI and a message to the users, letting them know that your application might be down because your services are down, or you might be updating certificates, a lot of different scenarios that might call for a maintenance message to be displayed. And it lends itself kind of perfectly to a remote config based implementation because of the level of like dynamic behavior and the level of control you'll have to be able to just flip a flag or toggle a flag, I should say, and decide whether or not the maintenance message is displayed. So let's step through a couple of slides of just kind of code and things to show you kind of the general breakdown of what we're going to be working with here today before we move into a bit of a walkthrough of an actual use case in Xcode. So here's just a basic JSON object that would represent the copy we might need for our actual UI alert and our title and message, as well as one simple flag here for whether it's enabled or not. You'll see that that's just a basic Boolean there set to false. And then stepping into the Swift type that will actually decode this JSON into, we've got here just another simple struct called remote config maintenance. You see here that it is conforming to Codable. And you'll notice that, again, just the same properties we have on our JSON object, a title, a message, and a flag for enabled. And you also notice, I'll step back quickly, you'll see that we use the exact same naming conventions here. And that is important with Codable because if you do not do that, you'll have to define a custom coding keys and let the decoding operation know what those keys or the naming convention that will be used on those keys. Still not overly complicated, but what we're looking for here is no additional code in our models unless absolutely necessary. All right, so let's step into a slide, and this kind of shows us kind of the core of our remote config implementation, because this remote config class gives us access to a helper called fetch, which kind of forms that line of communication between our app and the remote config dashboard. So what you see here is just some basic setup, nothing really out of the ordinary here, but I did want to call out 2 lines. So starting with this minimum fetch interval, you'll see here it's set to 0. This would only be done in a debug environment. In a production environment, remote config is rate limited. I believe it's 1 fetch every 15 minutes. Anything more frequent than that will be rate limited. So that is something to consider as you think about what use cases this might apply to. It's a rapid update, but not a necessarily immediate update. There are workarounds with cloud functions and a few other solutions that give you that, but out of the box, it is a rate limited service. And then I wanted to move to this. So this will actually check for a plist file, in this case called remote config defaults. And this is typically one of the first steps in your remote config implementation after actually making the connection between the two in terms of including the library and the basic setup steps. And what this will do is allow you to define a property list with keys and values that match what you have in your remote config dashboard that we'll see in just a moment. And it gives you the ability to let the app know what it should do in cases where network connection might not be available and a call out to remote config cannot be made. So those would need to be kept up to date as parameters and values change. So those are just 2 quick things to note there. All right, so this enum for remote config param, what this does is it gives us a swift type safe way to make sure that we've accounted for all of the parameters that we've entered in remote config. So we would just need to add a new entry to this enum, or new case rather, to this enum as new parameters are added. So for our first one, it would just be simple as this, adding a case for maintenance. And what we will see once we move over to the dashboard is that this will line up with what we add there. Stepping to the next slide. This is going to be just kind of our core utility helper here to actually access what's in our remote config parameters. So you'll see that it's just a basic function called getString. The type for the param is the remote config param enum that we just created, and it's going to return an optional string. And just for readability's sake, I broke the return into a new slide here, but here you'll see what remote config is actually doing. It offers this helper to do just a key value lookup based on the raw value of the param, which in this case would be maintenance. And then it goes to access the string value, and that does return an optional. So that's why the function was returning an optional there. All right, so I think the best way to kind of demonstrate what's going on here is to go ahead and step over to the remote config dashboard. So you'll see here, I am in Firebase, project's already been created, and it draws your attention immediately to adding a parameter. So here, for this, we're just going to enter the key there as maintenance, like we just saw. And I've actually already created that JSON object here. Let's go ahead and open this. This is another nice thing I wanted to call out about remote config. It actually gives you this nice interface for entering JSON here, and it actually gives you the ability to format it. It will validate it as you type, so you can make sure that you've got good values there. So you'll see again, just the same JSON object, title, message, and enabled. Let's go ahead and set that to true because we got word that we need to actually show that maintenance message. Let's go ahead and save that. And we'll add that as our first parameter. And then immediately you see in the dashboard there, we have a draft of our latest changes, and it's letting us very clearly know that we have unpublished changes. Let's go ahead and publish those changes. And now stepping over to our Xcode project here, go ahead and take a look at our get maintenance helper down here. So what this is actually going to do is access the get string helper that we wrote before, which you can see right above from the slide. It's going to look for the parameter maintenance. And we're going to guard against any bad values there just to make sure that we do have a safe JSON string, or a string rather, from remote config that we can then convert to data so we can pass it into our JSON decoder. And then we're going to do a very familiar thing here where we try to decode that JSON into our remote config maintenance type here. And if we're able to, then we will pass that back to the caller. I'll go ahead and jump over to where it's actually being called. So I have a very basic just app launch sequence routine here. So you'll notice that we make first a call out to fetch the cloud values. And then on success of that, we check if maintenance is enabled. And that will be again a call to get maintenance. And we can just check the enabled flag there. And if it is enabled, we'll go ahead and show the maintenance alert. Let's go ahead and run this. See there, it loaded for just a second, and now we have blocking UI displaying the copy for a maintenance message and not allowing users into the app because our services are currently down. So let's go back to the dashboard just so you can get an idea of how simple it would be to actually update this so that that is no longer showing. All we need to do is jump right back into the same parameter that we adjusted or that we created before and adjust it to have enabled set to false. Then we can go ahead and publish those changes. We'll jump back over here, rerun the app just so we make a fresh call out to fetch those cloud values. You see here is able to access the app. So that's just kind of a quick use case to just give you an idea of how simple something like that is. And this could obviously be housed, from an API-based solution for custom code written for you. But one thing that I like about remote config is that it breaks that process out of silence, or so to speak, behind something that needs kind of that development experience and opens up kind of like cross-domain collaboration for those conversations and even adjusting values for things that might need to be dynamically updated within your app. So I just wanted to step through one more quick example. Go back to my presentation here. For this one, it's going to be tabs. So as you saw on the simulator, I have a pretty basic, just kind of fallback value for my default tabs. It's just a tab 1 and tab 2. But let's say that we decide from a strategy standpoint that it would be good to actually dynamically load that content in and determine what the title and maybe a system image for our tabs and different things like that so that we can adjust those as we get feedback from analytics. Maybe users have gotten used to the tabs without a title, so we could remove that. Just anything you can think of there. So let's go ahead and add another parameter for tabs. Again, I will open the editor. I've got some JSON posted here. So you see just 4 basic tabs with a title and a system image name. This name maps to an SF symbol name. If you haven't checked out SF symbols, I would definitely encourage that. It's a great set of vector icons and things like that. So we'll go ahead and save this, add a parameter for that, get those changes published. And we'll go back to Xcode, and run that. So you'll see now we've got at the tab, in the tab bar, we have our 4 tabs. The logic is in place to actually do a lookup for those SF symbols. So we've got the proper icons and the view controller is properly displaying. But then again, just to give you an example, let's say strategy came back and so we really don't need that settings tab. We're just going to pull that into profile, clean up the bottom tab a little bit. So we can go ahead and save this, update that, publish those changes again, run our app. And there we go, just like that, the tab is gone. So these are 2 pretty simple use cases, but I know that at Shako we've leveraged this same concept for some pretty complicated use cases. So my hope here today is that this just kind of piqued your interest, maybe introduced you to remote config, maybe introduced you to Codable as well, and just showed you how those 2 technologies complement each other and work really well together. So I would definitely encourage you to check out the remote config documentation, dig into that, see about all the possibilities there. Definitely dig into the Codable documentation, see how powerful that API is there, and just let your imagination run wild. There are lots of possibilities. So I hope that you enjoyed my talk today, and everybody have a great rest of your day.
That's great, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna post the link to the Q&A Slack chat in the chat window right now. Anybody want
and one thing I did
there?
want to quickly call out, I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I wanted to quickly call out, I have that sample code for that project up on a GitHub repo, so I'm going to share that link, and I believe that'll be attached to the speaker profile, or it'll be available on the DevCamp website at some point. So
awesome.